arguing that Everton had broken the rules and they had gained an unfair advantage, and that advantage was more than enough to compensate for having Frank Lampard in the dugout. Hi, my name is Mike and this is my vlog about football in general and Burnley FC in particular, a vlog that was not successful in the ballot for derby tickets and has therefore launched all its toys into near-Earth orbit. Now this video is a little bit different in that it's not about Burnley in particular, although the Clarets are kind of involved from the sidelines, but it's more about Everton and their recent charges under the Premier League's financial fair play regulations. Now, this is not a deep dive into whether or not Everton have broken the rules over FFP, but it's more about what punishment, if they are found guilty, they are likely to receive. It's about what I think will happen and why the Premier League will yet again treat on-field matters and their own rule book as a sideshow to the main task of its existence, which is, of course, making obscene amounts of money. Now, there's a lot of background here, so you might want to grab yourself a brew before watching. Premier League rules aimed at curbing club losses state that a club is allowed to make a cumulative loss of £105 million over a 3-year period. According to their accounts, Everton have made a loss over a 3-year period of £370 million, including a 1-year loss of £120 million. Now, clubs are allowed to make losses over the limit if they are for things like women's teams or infrastructure such as a new stadium, as Everton are building. And whether these losses are allowed is for the panel to decide. The problem for the Premier League is that Everton were in a relegation dogfight last season, which they did, of course, survive. The two other clubs involved in that battle, Leeds and Burnley, made a complaint prior to the end of last season, arguing that Everton had broken the rules and they had gained an unfair advantage, and that advantage was more than enough to compensate for having Frank Lampard in the dugout. When Leeds survived, and Burnley went down, but Leeds survived, they withdrew their complaint. Marching on together indeed. So what will happen if the complaint is upheld? We can very easily figure it out by simply looking at what the Premier League does with misbehaving clubs, and the short answer is close their eyes and hope it goes away. Now, the evidence for this is there are two important cases that you need to look at when it comes to telling you how the Premier League deals with issues. The first is in 2008, and Portsmouth were in big trouble. Their Russian owner had spent way more than he could afford, and he was looking to pull the plug on funding the club. Now, the Premier League knew that one of its clubs going into administration was very bad for the brand. Until that point, no Premier League club had gone into administration. Plenty of Championship and lower clubs had gone into administrations with ITV Digital, but no Premier League club had gone into administration by that point. So they were doing everything they could to avoid it happening. And this meant dragging the whole situation out for as long as possible to avoid doing anything of significance, until hopefully the situation fixed itself. And the Russian, whose money, by the way, was never really his, sold up to a man called Suleiman Al-Fahim. And everyone, especially in the Premier League, breathed a sigh of relief. Except there was a problem. Suleiman Al-Fahim didn't actually have the money. The Premier League, in their desire to avoid having a club go into administration, did not properly check him out. They just wanted the deal done. And checking that Al-Fahim actually had the money he said he did, well, he said he did. And that was good enough for them. But he didn't have it. And just under 2 months later, Al-Fahim was forced to sell up. This time, the owner was a man called Ali Al-Faraj. Slight problem with this. The Russian owner, he ran out of money. Suleiman Al-Fahim never had the money. But Al-Faraj, there is no evidence he ever existed at all. There are no interviews with him. There is no press releases from him. There are no photos of him. If I wanted to open a bank account or start a job, I have to provide photographic proof of my ID. If I wanted to buy Portsmouth FC in 2009, the Premier League was so desperate they didn't even ask for that. But eventually Portsmouth did go into administration and they did get a 9-point penalty for doing so. But here is the key point. A man who did not exist took over the club in October. Pompey went into administration in February. Pompey were bottom of the league from the second game of the season. They finished 17 points from safety. So that 9-point deduction, when it finally arrived, was never going to make a difference. Oh, and by the way, you'll never guess who Portsmouth beat the day after they went into administration. Yep, us, 2-1. The second case I'm going to talk about features Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano. The last day of the transfer window in August 2006, and West Ham unveiled two of the hottest South American talents to a blaze of, well, suspicious non-publicity. Now, both players didn't really settle in London at first, although Mascherano was bought by Liverpool in January, and that is when the red flags got raised. Because Premier League rules state that players have to be owned by clubs. It turned out that Tevez and Mascherano were partially owned by a third party, the agent Kia Joorabchian. Now, this was against Premier League rules, and the West Ham owners knew this at the time, but they were in the process of selling the club, so they didn't care, and they actually told a direct lie to the Premier League. Besides, they were going to be long gone before anyone found out, or at least that's what they thought. The Mascherano transfer happened in January. West Ham were in relegation trouble at that point, but the Premier League didn't bring charges until the start of early March. And at that point, West Ham were 10 points from safety. But a good run of form saw them edging towards safety, and by the time the Hammers beat fellow relegation strugglers Wigan at the end of April, the Premier League punishment for, let us not forget, directly lying to them and fielding two ineligible players, knowingly, for the best part of a season, was a fine of £5.5 million. And even in the judgment, the head of the investigating commission actually said that the timing made a difference to the punishment. And if the hearing had been held earlier, a points deduction, and I quote directly from him, would have been easier to bear. I thought lawyers were supposed to be good at not saying the quiet part out loud. Because every club in the country, every fan knows, if you field an ineligible player, it gets treated as a loss for you and a win for the opposition. Non-league clubs often forfeit cup matches because of the rules, and occasionally you do hear of a league club losing out by playing a cup-type player when they shouldn't have done. But the Premier League did all they could to avoid punishing West Ham, and then Tevez scored 3 goals in the last 3 games of the season to keep West Ham up. As the Wigan manager Paul Jewell later said, I had someone from the Premier League in my office, and I said, if that had been Wigan or Watford who broke the rules, we'd have been getting a points deduction. The reason West Ham aren't is because they're a big club. His words were, I agree with you, but I'll never say that publicly. I think they were hoping West Ham were going to go down. Again, the league was so desperate to avoid being seen to interfere that they completely abdicated responsibility, and by not making a decision that affected West Ham, they made one that affected Wigan and Sheffield United, who, by the way, had to go to a tribunal to recover some of the money that they lost through being relegated. So that brings us to Everton. Will the Premier League try to avoid punishing Everton in a way that affects them compared to other clubs? And the precedent says yes. Not just the 2 cases I mentioned. Remember what happened last year. In the thick of a relegation battle, Everton played Chelsea. A flare was thrown onto the pitch, and Richarlison threw it back into the crowd. Everyone saw this, and everyone thought the same thing at the same time. That's a ban. It's against the rules. And yes, he was banned. 2 months later, after he had changed clubs. They accepted his reasoning that he was removing it from the pitch. Yeah, fine, whatever. But it's a straight up breach of the rules. that was delayed for just long enough to not affect anything. It's kind of like being caught on camera speeding and then the ban coming in only after you've sold your car. Well, only sort of, because Everton weren't affected, but Leeds and Burnley certainly were. And this is the thing. By doing nothing, the Premier League still affected something. Now, this isn't about who is the bigger club or who gets treated favourably or anything like that. It's about the essential cowardice at the top of the game. Is it cowardice or is it cynicism? We see this in society all the time. Laws and rules are applied subjectively depending on who it affects. If you claim £400 of universal credit that you weren't entitled to, that's a jail sentence. If you claim £4,000 of MP's expenses you aren't entitled to, that's a clerical error. Everton did not intentionally set out to break financial fair play rules. At worst, you can say they were overambitious at precisely the wrong time when a perfect storm of outside circumstances was going to affect them. But that's not the point. Neither is it the point that Everton will get punished in some form if found guilty. The point is that the punishment will be fluid and designed from the outset not to affect anything. This is what I think will happen. Despite the fact that the FFP rules were broken a couple of seasons ago, the Premier League will look at Everton's circumstances at the point of the judgment being handed down, and that will determine the punishment. If Everton are doing well, say top 10, it will be a points deduction, but it will be a points deduction that leaves them 15th. If they are struggling to avoid the drop, then it will be a points deduction but suspended because they don't want to affect the relegation battle. And someone, somewhere, will pay compensation to Burnley and Norwich and Watford. Let's say £10 million. Burnley might be back in the Premier League. Watford and Norwich are not going to say no to the money. The wrongdoers get a slap on the wrist. The affected get some shut up and go away money. Everyone knows it, including the clubs, because the Premier League is the clubs. They decide the punishments for themselves and they vote on them. So they will not do anything that could potentially rebound on them. A cynic might say that Manchester City will not vote to deduct points from Everton for a financial fair play violation because they themselves are under investigation, a quid pro quo, or 100 million quid pro quo. But that would be a tremendously cynical thing to think, and I'm a terrible person for even suggesting that as a possibility. But the Premier League will do what it always does. It will protect its brand and its image above its sporting integrity. Everton will likely be found guilty, but so what? It will matter to Everton, but it won't matter to anyone else, not least to the clubs who were affected. The Premier League will sail on. And a final thought. Manchester City, I mentioned Manchester City, they are facing 100 charges of breaking financial fair play regulations. Let's say that they are found guilty on the majority of them, or even all 100. What would you consider a suitable punishment? The Premier League are not going to relegate them. So how about they start the next 3 seasons with a 20-point deduction? Does that sound reasonable? Everyone else gets a 20-point head start for the next 3 years. That sounds like a good punishment, and you think most fans would accept that? Most journalists would agree that it was fine. Would you accept a 20-point deduction for Manchester City for 3 consecutive seasons as a reasonable punishment? Since the 2017-18 season, the minimum number of points that Manchester City were from missing out on the top 4, and therefore Champions League football, is 19. Forget it, Jake. It's football. So, thanks for making it to the end of this one. A little bit different. A little bit research required. I quite enjoyed doing it. Hopefully you enjoyed it as well. If you did, leave a comment down below. Click like if you liked it. Click subscribe if you really like what I'm doing and you'd like to see more of this. And in the meantime, take care.